Hey y'all, welcome to your first year of drum lessons, week 10. How does that happen? Time just keeps moving, I guess. So, my name is Penny Larson. I am super happy to have you with me today. Today we are going to talk about foot technique, basic patterns with your bass drum and your hi-hat. We're going all in on some basic patterns today. You can notice I don't even have half of my drum set because we're going to focus so much on our right and left feet. So much of what I'm doing today is based on the incredible work of the just beyond important Gary Chaffee with his pattern series, especially this one, which is the one I rely on the most and have really worked in the most, time functioning patterns. I am a huge believer in the philosophy of this book, which is that you break things down into their simple, repetitive, physical pieces, and then you master them, and then you can put them all together. So at no point are you trying to think of this big, long stream of notes. You're just linking these little patterns together. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. This is an essential must get at some point if you don't get it right now. If you are really joining me for your first time playing drums, this book might be a little overwhelming after 2.5 months, okay? But add this to your list, put this in your cart on Amazon, right? And when you're feeling a little adventurous, grab this book because I can't tell you how important this book is, okay? So we're going to have some handouts today, as usual. They're going to be a little different than usual. These are all pattern based. Okay, we're going to do each of these little snippets separately. Okay? And you want to do them over and over and over and over and over again. And in the coming weeks, we'll do patterns, longer patterns, drum beats, in which we'll be putting these all together, right? But if you can master these physically, don't worry about musical yet, right? Don't worry about playing musically with these. This is about, telling your body what to do when and mastering that. The musical interpretation part can come later, okay? We're trying to build a foundation to put music on top of. This first page, we're going to have an ostinato. Ostinato is just a short repeating pattern with our hands that is right hand and left hand together, right hand by itself. So right hand and left hand together, right hand by itself, over and over again. If I was going to think about what this represents out of a beat, I would think of this as either 2 and or 4 and. Okay, makes sense? So, we're going to play first. We're going to start with all the notes on the bass drum and gradually work our way down to fewer notes. This again is part of my philosophy that if you can play them all, you can play none of them, because playing them all is harder than playing none of them. Okay, so the first one I think is pretty simple. We're going to play right hand, left hand, and right foot together, right foot by itself, right hand and right foot together, right foot by itself. So your right foot is just playing 16th notes to the 8th note pattern with your hands. 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and The next pattern is 2/16 and an eighth. So your bass drum plays on 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and Now an eighth and 2/16 with your foot. So the bass drum plays on 1 and so both hands and right foot, then a 16th gap, right? And then right hand and right foot, and then right foot by itself. 3 E and 4 E and Now the bass drum pattern is an eighth. Now the bass drum pattern is a 16th, an eighth, and a 16th. So the bass drum doesn't play on and, it plays 1 E, okay? So the pattern is right hand and right foot together, right foot by itself, right hand by itself, right foot by itself. 3 E and 4 E and Now the bass drum is on E and okay? So the first note is just the two hands by itself, then right foot, right hand, right foot. 3 E and 4 E and Okay, now we're down to groups of 2 with our foot. The first one we're going to play is 1 E. So right hand, right foot together, right foot by itself, right hand by itself, and then a 16th gap after that. 3 E and 4 E and And some of these patterns where we're doubling the snare drum with the bass drum are a little unusual, but they're still important to work on because there are definitely styles of music where you will play the bass drum and snare drum at the same time. And so you want to get used to that independence ability as well. Speaking of, the next one is another one with bass drum and snare drum together. We're going to play eighth notes with our right foot. So this one hopefully might even be the easiest one on the page. Your right hand and your right foot are just going to play all the notes together, and your left hand is going to play every other note, right? 3 E and 4 E and Next, the bass drum plays a dotted eighth and a 16th. So right hand, right foot together, a 16th note gap, right hand, right foot. 3 E and 4 E and Now the bass drum has a 16th rest, an eighth note, and a 16th note. So the bass drum plays on E and then on So it's both hands, right foot, right hand, right foot. 3 E and 4 E and And now the bass drum plays on E and. So it's a 16th rest, a 16th note, and an 8th note. So now the 16th gap is at the end of the group. 3 E and 4 E and. And our last 2-note pattern with the bass drum, an 8th rest and 2 16ths, so the bass drum plays on and So I've got both hands and then that 16th gap, and then right hand and right foot together, and then right foot by itself. 3 E and 4 E and. And now off to the 1-note patterns. First, right on the beat. I lied about the other one. This one is the easiest. So we've got right hand, left hand, and right foot together, and then a 16th space, and then right hand, and then a 16th space. 3 E and 4 E and. Now we've got a 16th rest. The bass drum is on E, 3 E and 4 E and. Now the bass drum is on and. This is another contender for easiest one on the page. 3 E and 4 E and. And now the bass drum is on the so the last 16th note. 3 E and 4 E and. It's very important with all of these that you're playing a nice square 16th note rhythm. And what I mean by that is make sure, remember what a 16th note is, right? A 16th note is half the size of an 8th note. So you need to play your 16th note exactly in the middle of the 2 8th notes. If you rush it a little early or drag it, play it a little late, you're going to change the entire feel of the rhythm. And if you do that on this ground level when you're learning these patterns, it's going to be a big problem when we start to put these into actual drum beats. I think it goes without saying you should work on all these patterns without the snare drum too. So just your right hand and your right foot. Pretend the snare drum isn't notated there. Okay, so that's it for page 1. Page 2 are the same patterns with the feet, but we've changed up our ostinato. Now instead of the snare drum being on the beat, it's going to be on the and. Okay? This will help with quarter note grooves, because I could imagine that my snare drum is 1, 2 instead of 1 and, if these were quarter notes instead of 8th notes. But also, this is just going to help your understanding of where these notes are all falling physically, right? So our first one again is 16th notes of the bass drum. And now right hand first, and then both hands together on the and. 3 E and 4 E and. Now the 2 16ths and an 8th. 3 E and 4 E and Now the 8th and 2/16ths. 3 E and 4 E and the 16th, 8th, 16th. 3 E and 4 E and now the last 3 16th notes. 3 E and 4 E and now our groups of 2. First, the first 2, 1 E with the bass drum. 3 E and 4 E and at this tempo, that almost sounds like the We Will Rock You groove that we started with, right? A lot of the times these notes are written different ways just to facilitate different tempos, okay? I'm playing these all really slow. You should work on these really slow. At the end, I'll play a few of them a little bit quicker so you can see how they sound up to speed. But this isn't about playing them fast. This is about playing them perfectly. Okay, so next, now we're just on the 8th notes of the bass drum. 3 E and 4 E and now dotted 8th, 16th. 3 E and 4 E and 16th rest, 8th, 16th. 3 E and 4 E and 16th rest, 16th note, 8th note. 3 E and 4 E and 8th rest and 2 16th notes. 3 E and 4 E and and now the single notes. First the quarter note. 3 E and 4 E and 16th rest, dotted 8th note, 3 E and a, 4 E and a. Offbeat 8th note, 3 E and a, 4 E and a. And finally, dotted 8th rest with a 16th note. So the bass drum plays on the 3 E and a, 4 E and a. Okay, so take those basic patterns and play them a million times until they feel just second nature, right? I'm going to play through them, a couple of them a little quicker just so you can see how they sound. I'm going to just do them kind of randomly, so don't worry too much about following along. If you know which ones I'm doing, that's great, but this will just show you how they work. And I'm going to start with the first sheet that we did. So the snare drum is on the beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And now with the snare drum off the beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So as you get more familiar with them, mess around with them and just jump around randomly. The goal is so that you can play them smoothly from one to the next without thinking about it. Okay? Improvise, improvise, improvise with everything we ever learn. Don't be afraid of making mistakes, right? The only way to learn is to make mistakes. If everything you play sounds good, you're only playing things you know how to play, right? Don't be afraid of sounding bad in the practice room. Try not to be afraid of sounding bad on stage too. That one's a little bit more complicated. You don't want to sound bad on stage, but you want to be fearless on stage, right? Okay, so finally for today, I told you there's a lot of technique today. We're going to talk about opening the hi-hat. And likewise, we're going to approach this in a very pattern-based way. So I can open the hi-hat before the snare drum, in which case my left foot plays with my left hand. I can do that with a bass drum. So now my hi-hat is opening with the bass drum and my hi-hat is closing with the snare drum. I can open the hi-hat on the snare drum, and so then it's closing after the snare drum. I can do that with the bass drum. So now, in the way we're going to do this, the hi-hat is closing with the bass drum, so both feet are playing together here. I can play the snare drum on the beat and open it, and then the hi-hat closes on the and. I can do that with the bass drum on the and this is another one where both feet are going to play together. I can play the snare drum on one and open the hi-hat on the and, in which case now the hi-hat is going to close with the snare drum. And I can do that same thing but with the bass drum on the opening hi-hat. So these patterns are really repeated. The difference is where they fall in the measure. Okay? And of course we can open the hi-hat without the bass drum or the snare drum. And I think we've covered that already, so we don't really need to cover that again. So let's play through these really quick. So the first one, I'm going to open the hi-hat and hit it, right? So I'm going to hit the hi-hat. I'm trying to hit it right when I open it so I get a nice sizzle of both top and bottom cymbal. And then I'm going to play the snare drum when I close it. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now that same pattern with the bass drum when I'm opening the hi-hat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now I'm going to open the hi-hat on and with the snare drum. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And now that same pattern with the bass drum on 1. So now the feet are going to play together. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And now we're switching it up. The snare drum is going to be on the beat. So now I'm opening the hi-hat on the beat. Snare and hi-hat open together. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And now that same pattern with the bass drum on the and. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And now the snare is still on 1, but the hi-hat opens off the beat. So now the hi-hat is going to close when I play my snare. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And finally, that pattern with the bass drum on the offbeat 8th note. So now the hi-hat is going to open when the bass drum plays. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, so that's going to be it for today. There's a lot of patterns here. There's a lot of things for you to practice. Next week, we're going to go whole hog with these patterns and start to do beats that are using all of these elements and really creating some, we're starting to get into some complicated patterns, right? So it's important that you learn these patterns as well as you can between now and then. And again, this is another chance for me to say, remember that I am treating you as if you are a perfect and beautiful student, and you are a beautiful student, but it is unlikely you are a perfect student just because none of us are. And so if it takes you a couple weeks before you feel comfortable with this material, before you want to move on, that is totally cool. I have been fascinated by how quickly this material can move if I don't have a student in front of me who needs to review anything, okay? So we are going at breakneck pace. Do not feel bad if you can't keep up with the weekly schedule. Just because it's called your first year of drum lessons doesn't mean you have to finish the program in a year, okay? You go at the pace where you're digesting this material and feeling good about it. There is no such thing as one right speed to get through this stuff. And I think that was my sermon for the day, so I'll let you all go. So like I say, next week we're gonna put these into some drum beats, and that's super exciting. We're also gonna get back into some paradiddle stuff. I wanted to focus just on these patterns today because there's so much to do with these. So please focus on these in your practice whenever you get to this lesson. And I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you found this lesson helpful. Please give me a thumbs up if you did like this lesson. I will understand if you didn't like it and it needs a thumbs down. Please subscribe to my channel. It helps YouTube to know that people like my stuff, and it'll help you find my stuff more readily. If you really want to make sure you never miss any of my material, hit that notification bell down there and you'll get a notification when I release new videos. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Penny Larson Drums, and I would love to catch up with you there as well. But for now, I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you learned something today, and I love you all very much. All right, take care. Bye.